Dawn broke over Pine Grove, casting soft amber and gold hues across the modest homes that lined the quiet street. Among them, the Johnson family's two-story house stood resilient, its well-tended garden a testament to Sarah Johnson's tireless care. Inside, the sound of amazing grace filled the home, Sarah's warm voice rising and falling with the hymn, providing comfort in the midst of a world growing increasingly uncertain. At the kitchen table, Marcus Johnson sat, his dark eyes scanning the newspaper before him, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his coffee mug. The headline screamed at him, "Local family faces arson charges in Bancroft, warehouse fire, millions in damages claimed." He had already read it a dozen times, each word cutting deeper than the last. He had never expected to see his family in the news like this, accused of setting a fire they didn't commit. Sarah's voice wavered slightly as she continued to sing, but she pressed on, refusing to let the weight of their situation silence her. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air, the warmth of their kitchen in stark contrast to the fear that had begun to seep into their lives. Simone Johnson, upstairs in her room, had been up since 4 a.m., poring over her grandfather's old legal books. The towering stacks of worn volumes surrounded her, their pages smoothed by years of use. William Johnson, her late grandfather, had once been a feared attorney, and his legacy lived on in the margins of those pages. Simone's heart raced as she flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything, that might help her family's case. Just as she closed the book, the familiar sound of her mother's voice reached her from downstairs, drawing her back into the reality of the kitchen. She stood, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest, and descended the stairs. Simone paused at the kitchen doorway, observing the tense atmosphere. Her father's shoulders were rigid, his usually relaxed demeanor clouded by the heaviness of the situation. Her mother, normally so composed, moved a little more cautiously, her every gesture tinged with the strain that had been growing in their lives over the past weeks. "Morning, baby," Sarah called, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips as she placed a plate of eggs in front of Marcus. "Up early again?" Simone nodded, settling into her chair. "I've been reviewing Grandpa's notes on the Wilson case from 1982. He defended a family against false accusations from a developer back then, too." Her voice faltered as she hesitated, looking down at her notebook before continuing. "Daddy, Mr. Patterson called last night." Marcus looked up sharply. "What did he say?" Simone opened her notebook, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "He's withdrawing from the case. He said he received threats, but wouldn't give any details. He said it would be better for everyone if he stepped away." The kitchen fell silent. Even Sarah's singing stopped. The tension in the air was palpable as the weight of the situation sank in. Marcus slammed his coffee mug down, the liquid spilling over the rim, but he didn't seem to notice. "He can't do that," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "The trial starts in 3 weeks. He can't just abandon us now." Simone closed her notebook with a deliberate motion. "I've called every law firm in the directory. No one will take the case. They're all too afraid of Boft. They won't say it, but that's the truth." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing the floor. "Henderson and Associates won't touch it. Mitchell's group is too busy. Bradford and Peters won't return my calls." His voice was tight with frustration. "What are we supposed to do now?" Simone stood, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I could do it." Her parents turned to her in disbelief. "Absolutely not," Marcus said firmly. Simone sat in her bedroom, the early morning light creeping in through the blinds. Books and legal notes were scattered across her desk, and her grandfather's old briefcase sat at her side, as though waiting for her to make a decision. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the old fan. But Simone's mind raced. She'd always known that one day she'd be expected to carry on her grandfather's legacy. But this was more than she had ever imagined. She turned the page of one of his old law books, her fingers skimming over the worn edges of the paper. William Johnson had never backed down from a fight, no matter how impossible it seemed. He had faced down corrupt judges, crooked developers, and threats to his life. But he had always fought with the law as his weapon, and now she was facing the same battle. She wasn't a lawyer, not yet, but she had learned everything he knew. She had watched him over the years, learning not just the technicalities of the law, but the passion and unshakable resolve that came with it. It was that same fire that had driven her to this point. She reached for the phone, scrolling through the list of contacts. But as expected, no one would take the case. Not even Mr. Patterson, the seasoned lawyer who had defended families like hers for years. The name Richard Boft loomed like a shadow over everything. The corruption, the intimidation, the sheer power of money, it all seemed insurmountable. But Simone wasn't about to give up. Not now. She had to do something. If no one else would stand up for her family, she would. Simone stood up, her heart pounding as she walked to the window. Pine Grove, a quiet and close-knit community, seemed peaceful at this hour, the streets bathed in soft morning light. But behind that serenity there was a storm brewing, one that threatened to tear everything apart. The weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders. If she didn't act, the developers would win. Her family would lose everything. She glanced back at the legal books spread out across the desk. Her grandfather's law books. They had been her guide, but now they felt heavy, like the entire legacy of the Johnson family rested in her hands. She grabbed a piece of paper, scribbling a list of things to do. File a notice of appearance as counsel, request a hearing to represent her family, gather evidence, interview witnesses, prepare her arguments. Simone's mind raced as she worked. She had no experience in a courtroom, no degree, no credentials. All she had was her grandfather's wisdom and the unwavering belief that justice was worth fighting for. She would stand for her family, for Pine Grove, and for everything that was being threatened. Her parents came in shortly after, their faces drawn with worry. Sarah hesitated at the door, her voice soft but filled with concern. "Baby, are you sure about this? This isn't just a school debate. You're going up against Richard Boft and a whole army of lawyers." Simone looked up from her papers, meeting her mother's eyes. She didn't have all the answers, but she had something more important. Resolve. "I know it's dangerous, Mama, but if we don't do something, they'll take everything. We can't just stand by and watch." Marcus stepped forward, his face torn between pride and fear. "You're not alone in this. We'll help you, Simone, but we have to be smart about it." Simone nodded. The fight had only just begun. Simone sat at the kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee cooling beside her as she flipped through her grandfather's handwritten notes. She had spent hours poring over legal texts, but it was his notes, scratched down in the margins of cases and statutes, that truly spoke to her. William Johnson had left a legacy of defiance, of challenging the system, and Simone felt the weight of that legacy every time she opened one of those worn books. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence of the room. In less than 3 weeks, the trial would begin, and Simone had no intention of sitting idly by while her family's future was decided by corrupt men with money to burn. But every time she thought she had a plan, doubt crept in. Could a 17-year-old really stand up to Richard Boft and his army of powerful lawyers? Could she actually win? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Mrs. Walker, their elderly neighbor, standing in the doorway, her hands wringing the hem of her cardigan. The familiar sight of the frail woman, always so composed, now looked different. Nervous, uncertain. "I've been thinking about what you said, Simone," Mrs. Walker said quietly, stepping inside. "About testifying, about the fire." Her voice faltered, but she straightened, the years of experience and standing up for what was right evident in her eyes. "I can't let them silence me anymore. I have to help." Simone's heart raced. She hadn't expected this. Mrs. Walker's testimony could be the key piece to unraveling the case against her family, but she also knew that the consequences for speaking out would be dire. Simone stood up quickly, the weight of Mrs. Walker's words settling heavily on her shoulders. "You're sure about this, Mrs. Walker?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. "This isn't just about telling the truth. It's about standing up against a system that will try to crush us." The older woman nodded, her face set with determination. "Your grandfather defended my family once, when no one else would. I remember it like it was yesterday. They tried to take our house too, and he fought for us. Now it's my turn to fight for you." Simone's chest tightened, her mind racing as she processed the enormity of what Mrs. Walker was offering. Her testimony could be the difference between winning and losing, but it would also make her a target. Simone knew that Richard Boft's network wasn't just built on money, it was built on fear, and fear had a way of silencing even the bravest of voices. "Thank you," Simone whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had thought she was alone in this fight, but now with Mrs. Walker's support, it felt like she had a fighting chance. The truth would have a voice, and it wasn't going to be silenced. As Mrs. Walker left, Simone felt a renewed sense of purpose, but there was still much to be done. She returned to her desk, gathering the evidence she had so far: photos, witness statements, and the fire inspector's report. Every piece of the puzzle had to fit together, and while she knew they would try to destroy every piece of evidence she uncovered, she also knew that there was one thing they couldn't take from her: the truth. The next few days were a blur of interviews and frantic research. Simone's parents helped where they could, but it was clear that this battle was hers to fight. She spent hours on the phone, reaching out to every witness she could find, trying to build a defense. But every time she thought she was making progress, another obstacle appeared. One more lawyer, one more threat, one more lie to uncover. The courthouse loomed ahead, its tall columns and imposing facade, a stark reminder of the battle that awaited Simone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3. The nerves that had threatened to overtake her in the past few days were now replaced by a singular, unwavering resolve. She wasn't just representing her family today. She was standing for something much bigger: justice. She adjusted her best suit, one she had borrowed from her mother, and tightened her grip on her grandfather's old briefcase. It felt heavy in her hands, but it was a comfort. Every crease, every worn edge told her that she wasn't alone. William Johnson's spirit was with her, and it was that spirit that had driven her to this moment. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The seats were nearly filled with spectators, reporters, and lawyers who had come to watch the unprecedented trial unfold. The whispers grew louder as people noticed Simone walking in. Her youth, her inexperience, and the fact that she was a teenage girl representing her family against one of the most powerful men in the state, Richard Boft, was a spectacle in itself. As she made her way to the defense table, the eyes of the room followed her. The judge, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes, barely acknowledged her presence. "Court is in session," he barked, his gavel striking the bench with an authority that made the room fall silent. Simone took a deep breath, sitting at the table as her parents settled beside her. Her father's hand rested on hers, giving her a sense of steadiness, but she could feel the weight of their expectations. This wasn't just about winning, it was about surviving. Simone's hands trembled slightly as she laid out her documents on the table, her grandfather's law books neatly stacked beside her. She took a deep breath, scanning the room. Across from her, Richard Boft sat with his legal team, his sharp gaze briefly meeting hers. He didn't acknowledge her, but his expression was one of smug confidence. He thought this would be easy, a game to be won with his money and power. But he hadn't counted on Simone. Judge Malcolm Kessler, the man presiding over the case, leaned forward, his sharp gaze focused on the proceedings. He had a reputation for being tough on defendants, particularly those like Simone, who didn't have the credentials to be there. She had heard whispers about his past decisions, how he had often sided with the wealthy and powerful, but she couldn't afford to let his bias intimidate her. She had to prove herself, not just to him, but to everyone watching. "Miss Johnson," Judge Kessler said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I trust you understand the gravity of these proceedings. I expect you to conduct yourself with the decorum this court demands." Simone nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Kessler's eyes flicked to her briefcase, then back to her. "Proceed, then." With a quiet nod, Simone stood and moved to the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon her. She cleared her throat and began, her voice strong, despite the pounding of her heart. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "the truth is simple. My family is innocent. The evidence you will see today is fabricated, manipulated, and twisted in order to serve the interests of Richard Boft and his company." There was a murmur in the gallery, and Simone could feel the eyes of the jurors on her. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. She continued, her confidence growing with every word. This case is not about accountability. It's about power. And today we will show you that the truth will prevail, no matter how hard Mr. Boft and his lawyers try to bury it. The days following the first day of trial were a blur of meetings, late-night research, and mounting pressure. Simone had spent hours going through every piece of evidence, rechecking witness statements, and piecing together inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. It wasn't easy. The courtroom had been an intimidating place, but her resolve was stronger than ever. Each passing day brought new challenges and new threats. Simone stood in front of her desk, her eyes fixed on the fire inspector's report. The inconsistencies in the document were glaring, but she needed more. She needed something concrete that would crack the foundation of Boft's case wide open. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen. Ashley, the junior clerk from the courthouse. Simone quickly swiped to answer. "Simone, you need to look at this." Ashley's voice came through the phone, breathless. "I found something in the system, something that could help us." Simone's heart quickened. "What is it?" "Surveillance footage. It doesn't match the timeline they're claiming. And there's more. There's a witness who can verify it, but I need to meet you first. I'll explain everything. 10 minutes, break room." Simone's mind raced. This could be the break she had been waiting for. She grabbed her legal pad and scribbled a quick note to her parents telling them she was stepping out. The courthouse felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. Every corner seemed to harbor someone watching, someone waiting to strike. As she made her way to the break room, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being watched. The air inside was stifling, and as she stepped through the door, her eyes immediately locked with Ashley's. "There's something they're hiding," Ashley said, voice low. "This could be the key." Simone sat down, her pulse racing, ready to hear what Ashley had uncovered. Ashley slid a folder across the table, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder. "I had to be careful, Simone. I could lose my job for this." She looked around one more time before continuing. "But you need to see this." Simone opened the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a set of documents. She flipped through them quickly, scanning each page, her heart racing with anticipation. The documents detailed the security footage from the night of the fire, but there was something off about them. The timestamps didn't match the ones in the prosecution's evidence, and the footage itself, it was different from what had been shown in court. Simone's eyes widened as she saw the discrepancy. The footage they had presented was edited. There was no way to deny it. This is proof," Simone whispered, her voice barely audible. "They've been manipulating the evidence from the beginning." Ashley nodded, looking around nervously. "I'm not supposed to be showing you this, but I thought you needed to know. There's more footage. Footage that proves your family wasn't involved in the fire. It's been buried, hidden in the system. If we can get it into the courtroom, we can tear their case apart." Simone's mind raced as she processed the information. This was it. This was the break she had been hoping for. But there was a catch. "How do we get this into the court? We need to make sure it's authenticated. Otherwise, it's just another piece of suspicious evidence." Ashley bit her lip. "I have a contact who can help with that, but we'll need to act fast. If Boft's team finds out we're onto them, they'll bury it for good." Simone's mind was already calculating the risks, weighing her options. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. The evidence was too important. "I'll handle it," Simone said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "I'm filing a motion. We have to do this right now." The next morning, Simone stood outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of the briefcase in her hand. The air was cool and the building loomed ahead, its grandeur reminding her of the immense task ahead. She had spent the night preparing, gathering everything she needed to present the new evidence that could change the course of the trial. Her parents were waiting inside the courthouse, their faces tight with worry, but Simone knew this was her fight now. She had to be the one to take the next step, to expose the truth. With each step she took toward the entrance, the weight of her decision pressed down on her, but she felt stronger, more certain than ever. Inside, the usual bustle of lawyers and court staff filled the air. The buzz of whispered conversations did little to calm her nerves. As she approached the clerk's desk, her heart thudded in her chest. She had never filed a motion before. Her hands were slightly trembling as she set the briefcase down and presented the documents. "I need to file a motion to present new evidence," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. "This evidence was omitted from the initial discovery, and I believe it's crucial to the case." The clerk looked at her skeptically. "You're representing yourself, right?" Simone nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'm representing my family." The clerk raised an eyebrow but took the documents. "I'll make sure the judge gets it. The hearing will be scheduled for this afternoon." Simone breathed a small sigh of relief. At least they had a chance. As she made her way to the courtroom, she spotted Richard Boft sitting with his legal team. The arrogance in his posture, the smugness of his expression, it was all there. He hadn't expected a fight like this. Simone stepped into the courtroom with purpose, ready to face the next challenge. Simone stood at the back of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest as the judge entered. Judge Kessler was known for his stern demeanor and his long history of siding with powerful interests. But today he had no idea what Simone had in store for him. She watched as he settled into his seat, his gavel striking with an air of finality. The court clerk called for order, and the room grew still. Simone's mind raced as she gathered her papers, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. She had filed her motion, presented her evidence, and now it was time to see if the judge would allow it to be heard. "Miss Johnson," Judge Kessler's voice cut through the silence, his cold eyes meeting hers. "You filed a motion for new evidence. Explain to me why this should be allowed." Simone straightened her back, her grandfather's words echoing in her mind. "The law may be a tool, but justice is a flame." She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice firm. "Your Honor, the evidence we are presenting was intentionally withheld by the prosecution. It is crucial to the defense, and it proves beyond doubt that my family did not commit the crime they've been accused of." She paused, watching the judge closely. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "We've uncovered security footage in financial records that were concealed by Mr. Boft's legal team. The footage shows inconsistencies that prove the timeline presented by the prosecution is false." Kessler's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of hesitation. "And you expect me to admit this evidence without proper verification?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Simone didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor. If we wait for verification, it may be too late. The evidence will be tampered with, hidden, or lost. We need to act now to ensure a fair trial." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. Simone's heart raced, but she held her ground. Finally, Kessler spoke again. "Very well. I'll allow a hearing on this motion, but be aware, Miss Johnson, this is your only chance." Simone nodded, feeling a surge of relief. She had been given a shot. Now it was up to her to prove the truth. The hearing for the new evidence was set for the following morning. Simone barely slept the night before, her mind running over every possible scenario. She knew this could be the turning point in the trial, the moment when everything could shift in her family's favor, or the moment when everything could fall apart. But she had no choice but to press on. The stakes were too high. By the time she arrived at the courthouse, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Reporters had gathered outside, buzzing about the teenage lawyer who was challenging Richard Boft and his team of high-powered attorneys. Simone felt their eyes on her as she passed, but she didn't let it distract her. She had one focus: the truth. Inside the courtroom, Judge Kessler was already seated, his gavel poised and ready to start. He looked up as she entered and nodded to the defense table. "Miss Johnson, I trust you are prepared to present your motion." Simone nodded, her heart racing but her hands steady as she set her documents down. She looked at her parents, who were seated just behind her, and drew strength from their presence. They had believed in her from the beginning, and now she would do everything she could to repay that faith. The room fell silent as Simone addressed the judge. "Your Honor, as I outlined in the motion, the new evidence we've uncovered directly contradicts the prosecution's case. The surveillance footage and financial records were hidden from us. We believe they were deliberately withheld to mislead the jury and cover up the truth." Victoria Hale, Boft's lead attorney, stood up quickly, her face flushed with frustration. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing but a fishing expedition. The defense is just grasping at straws." Simone held her ground, locking eyes with the judge. The prosecution has manipulated the evidence. We're not grasping at straws, we're presenting the truth. Judge Kessler leaned forward, his expression hard to read. Miss Hale, I will not tolerate any more games. If there is evidence that has been deliberately withheld, it will be addressed. Simone's pulse quickened at the judge's words. She had taken a gamble, but it seemed like it was paying off. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her as she continued. The surveillance footage we found doesn't just contradict the timeline presented by the prosecution, it exposes a pattern of deception. I have here a document from the warehouse security system that shows an unexplained gap in coverage that directly correlates with the time the fire started. We believe that crucial footage was deliberately erased, and that's why we're here today, to ensure the truth comes out. Simone stepped back, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, sensing a shift in their attention. Some of them had looked skeptical at the beginning of the trial, but now they were listening, really listening. Victoria Hale was visibly rattled as she shot a glance at Richard Boft, who was sitting quietly, his jaw clenched. She seemed to be gathering herself, ready for a counterattack. Your Honor, Hale began, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The defense is suggesting that Mr. Boft, a respected businessman, would deliberately hide evidence to frame this family. That is absurd. Simone's eyes flashed with determination. What's absurd, Ms. Hale, is that you and your client have been using their wealth and influence to try and bury the truth. It's clear now that the fire wasn't an accident, and it wasn't started by my family. It was part of a larger scheme to take over our neighborhood. The courtroom was tense, and the murmurs of disbelief among the spectators grew louder. Even some of the jurors exchanged looks. Simone had them on the edge of their seats now, and she wasn't going to back down. Judge Kessler remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. I'll review the evidence and rule on this matter after a short recess. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes. Simone sat back down at the defense table, her mind buzzing. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but she couldn't let up now. The hardest part was still to come. The recess felt like an eternity. Simone could hear the murmurs of the courtroom buzz around her, the tension palpable. People were talking, some skeptical, others intrigued, but all eyes were on her. Her parents sat next to her, their hands clenched together, but their pride for their daughter was evident. They had supported her every step of the way, and now in this moment they were quietly waiting for the judge's ruling. Simone had taken risks today, but it had been worth it. The footage, the financial records, everything she'd uncovered was now out in the open. There was no turning back. She had laid the groundwork for the truth to come to light, but that didn't mean the battle was over. The prosecution would fight back harder than ever, and she had to be ready. When Judge Kessler returned to the bench, the entire room fell into a hushed silence. His cold, calculating gaze swept over the courtroom, and Simone stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her documents. The gavel struck, signaling the resumption of the hearing. Miss Johnson, the judge's voice rang out, his tone hard to decipher. I've reviewed the evidence presented, and while I am skeptical of the claims regarding tampered footage, I find that there is enough reasonable doubt to warrant further investigation. Simone's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment she'd worked for. She couldn't let her emotions take over now. I will allow the introduction of the new evidence, but the court will require time to fully authenticate and verify it, Kessler continued, his words cutting through the tension. In the meantime, we will proceed with the trial, but I expect the defense to remain focused on the facts and not stray into unsubstantiated claims. Simone nodded, her chest swelling with a mixture of relief and resolve. She had been given a chance. Now she had to make the most of it. Simone returned to her seat, feeling both the weight and the momentum of the moment. This wasn't a win yet, but it was progress. The new evidence had been allowed, and that was a huge step forward. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead, proving it in front of the jury, making sure they saw what she saw, and showing them that the truth couldn't be buried by money and power. As the trial resumed, Victoria Hale's calm exterior seemed to be slipping. The polished, confident lawyer had been rattled by the judge's decision, and Simone could see the tension building in her posture. She'd have to dig deeper now. The prosecution would fight back with everything they had. And this was no longer just about defending her family. It was about bringing down an empire built on lies. Simone prepared herself for the next phase. It was time for cross-examinations, and she knew that if she could expose even one crack in Boft's carefully constructed narrative, the whole case would begin to unravel. She watched as Hale began her next round of questioning, trying to keep her mind focused on the evidence and the strategy she had spent so many sleepless nights planning. The witness was called to the stand, a security expert who had been hired by the prosecution to validate the altered footage. He was a tall, confident man, well-groomed in a sharp suit, and he had the demeanor of someone who knew his credibility was on the line. Simone's eyes narrowed. She had studied his credentials, and there was something off about him. The expert had worked with Boft's company before. His testimony could be the key to revealing the corruption that was hiding behind the veil of legal jargon. As Hale began her direct examination, Simone's mind raced. She would need to be precise, methodical. There was no room for mistakes. Simone sat at the defense table, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the briefcase. The courtroom felt different now, charged with an energy that could only come from an unfolding revelation. The security expert had just finished testifying, his words filled with technical jargon meant to confuse. But Simone wasn't intimidated. She knew the truth, and she was ready to expose it. The expert had claimed that the footage shown to the court was legitimate, that the timestamps and angles had been validated by his extensive review. But something didn't sit right with her. She had spent hours studying the original footage in the new evidence that had been uncovered, and she knew there were inconsistencies. This was where she could strike. This was where the tide could turn in her favor. As the expert finished his testimony, Simone stood, her heart racing but her mind clear. She wasn't just going to cross-examine him, she was going to dismantle his credibility, piece by piece. "Mr. Franklin," she began, her voice steady, "you testified that you reviewed the footage and found it to be consistent with the timeline of the fire. Is that correct?" The expert nodded, his confident smile never wavering. "Yes, that's correct." Simone took a deep breath and pulled out a document. "Then, Mr. Franklin, I have here a report from the original security system installation contract. It states that the cameras used in the warehouse were TR-750 models, designed for enhanced night vision and low-light conditions. Yet in the footage you reviewed, there are inconsistencies in the lighting that cannot be explained by these specifications." The expert's smile faltered, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Simone pressed on, her eyes never leaving his. "You claim to be an expert in security systems, Mr. Franklin, but you failed to notice these inconsistencies, didn't you? In fact, you were hired by Mr. Boft's company less than a month ago. Is that correct?" Mr. Franklin's face went pale, and for the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. I'm not sure what you mean," he stammered, trying to maintain his composure. Simone pressed on, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You're not sure? You're the lead security expert for Bankov Developments, and you're telling this court that you didn't notice a discrepancy in the lighting that should have been impossible given the equipment installed at the warehouse?" She stepped forward, placing the documents in front of him. "These are the technical specifications for the TR-750 camera system. The footage we've been shown clearly doesn't match these standards. And you, Mr. Franklin, have no direct knowledge of the system's installation because you weren't even employed by Bankov when it was put in place, were you?" Franklin shifted uncomfortably, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. I reviewed the footage. That's all I'm here to testify to." Simone's eyes narrowed as she prepared to make her move. "But you didn't review the system before, did you? You didn't see the inconsistencies that were there from the beginning, because, as you just admitted, you weren't even working with Bankov until after the footage was already filmed." She paused, letting the words sink in. The expert was trapped, his earlier statements crumbling under the weight of her cross-examination. Simone turned to the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Franklin's testimony is flawed. He wasn't there when the cameras were installed. He wasn't there when the footage was captured. And yet, he claims to validate it without a second thought." The room was silent as Simone's words hung in the air. She turned back to Franklin, her gaze intense. "You were brought in for one purpose, Mr. Franklin, to cover up for the mistakes of your employer, Richard Boft. But you won't succeed, not here, not now. Franklin's face flushed, and for a moment, he seemed on the verge of collapse. He stammered, his credibility now in tatters, as the weight of his lies became evident to everyone in the courtroom. Simone had landed a critical blow. The truth was coming to light, and there was no turning back. Simone stood at the podium, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins after the devastating cross-examination of the prosecution's expert witness. The momentum had shifted. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. The jury, once skeptical, now seemed to be leaning toward the defense. She had exposed the cracks in the prosecution's case, but she knew this was just one battle. The war was far from over. As she returned to her seat, she could see Richard Boft sitting in the front row of the gallery, his jaw clenched in frustration. He hadn't expected things to go this way. He had expected to crush the Johnson family with ease, using his wealth and influence to silence them. But now there was doubt, real doubt, and it was spreading. Victoria Hale, his lead attorney, was already gathering her papers, her expression one of calculated calm, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders. She had underestimated Simone, just like Boft had, and now the truth was starting to come out. The fire, the false accusations, the manipulation. It was all falling apart. Simone felt her father's hand on her shoulder, steady and supportive. She looked over at him, grateful for his quiet strength. They had come this far together, and they would see it through to the end. The judge, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments," Judge Kessler announced. His voice was as cold as ever, but Simone could tell that even he had been shaken by the events of the day. As the gallery began to empty, Simone gathered her papers and stood up, her mind already turning to her closing argument. She knew that tomorrow would be the final opportunity to seal her family's fate. The next day, the courtroom felt more intense than ever. Today was the day that would determine everything. The weight of the case, the truth, and her family's future all rested on Simone's shoulders. Her nerves were steady, the adrenaline from the previous days having shifted into a quiet, focused energy. She had prepared her closing argument for hours, crafting every word, ensuring that she would leave no doubt in the jury's mind. As she sat at the defense table, Simone glanced at her parents. They gave her a small, encouraging nod. They had always believed in her, even when she wasn't sure she could believe in herself. Today, their faith was the solid foundation beneath her feet. Victoria Hale rose to make her closing argument first. She spoke with practiced ease, her tone smooth as if she had done this 1,000 times. Her words were persuasive, her arguments precise. She laid out the narrative the prosecution had built, attempting to show that the Johnson family was guilty of starting the fire out of greed and spite. Her words painted the family as the villains in the story, trying to destroy the progress and prosperity that Richard Boft represented. Simone could see the jury's faces, some nodding in agreement, others skeptical. But she knew better than to be intimidated by Hale's polished performance. She had the truth on her side, and now it was her turn to speak. When the room fell silent, Simone stood and moved to the podium. She didn't need to glance at her notes. Everything she needed to say had already been written in her heart. She took a deep breath, her voice clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't about the Johnson family. It's about something much bigger. It's about the abuse of power, about using wealth and influence to destroy innocent lives for profit." Simone's words rang out with the kind of conviction that made everyone in the room listen. She continued, pointing out the lies, the manipulated evidence, and the witnesses who had been coerced into testifying against her family. The final words of Simone's closing argument echoed in the courtroom, her voice filled with unshakable conviction. She had laid bare the entire story, the manipulation, the lies, the ruthless ambition that had driven Richard Boft and his empire to try and destroy her family. She had fought with everything she had, every ounce of strength, and every bit of truth she could muster. And now all that was left was for the jury to decide. Simone took a step back from the podium, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She could feel her heart pounding, but it wasn't the frantic rush of fear. No, it was the quiet, steady thrum of determination. She had done everything she could. All she could do now was wait. As she returned to her seat, she exchanged a brief glance with her parents. Her mother's eyes were filled with unshed tears, but there was pride there too. And her father, his jaw was set, his hands clenched. But there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. It had been a long road, but they had come this far together. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours, and during that time, the courtroom remained tense. Reporters and onlookers whispered in hushed voices, and even the most seasoned lawyers in the room could feel the weight of the moment. Simone's mind raced as she sat, trying to predict what the jury would decide. She had presented the truth, irrefutable, clear, and unyielding. But would they see it? Would they believe it? Or would the power of Boft's empire be enough to sway their decision? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the jury room opened, and the foreman stepped forward, holding the verdict. The room fell completely silent as the jury foreman walked up to the judge's bench, the paper with the verdict clutched tightly in his hands. Simone's heart pounded in her chest, each second stretching out longer than the last. Her parents sat quietly beside her, their hands gripping the edge of the table. The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Kessler motioned for the foreman to approach. The foreman cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room before focusing on the judge. "We have reached a verdict, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision he was about to announce. Simone's breath caught in her throat as she watched the foreman hand the verdict to the judge. It felt as though time had stopped entirely. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Judge Kessler, whose face remained unreadable. The judge opened the envelope slowly, scanning the paper, and then looked up. His voice, when it came, was firm and final. "In the matter of the insurance fraud and conspiracy charges against Richard Boft and Bank of Developments, how do you find?" The foreman stood tall and clear, his voice carrying across the room. "We find the defendant, Richard Boft, guilty on all counts." The words hit like a shockwave, and for a moment, the courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Simone's heart raced as she processed the verdict. Guilty, they had won, but it wasn't over. There was one more thing that needed to be said. "In the matter of criminal charges against the Johnson family," the foreman continued, "we find them not guilty on all counts." The room erupted in whispers and gasps of disbelief, but Simone didn't hear any of it. Her parents embraced her tightly, and she could feel the weight of the past weeks lifting off her shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of relief. They had done it. The courtroom buzzed with excitement as the judge prepared to deliver his final words. But Simone barely heard him. She was still trying to process the weight of the verdict, the feeling of victory that had surged through her as the jury declared her family innocent and Richard Boft guilty. The world outside the courthouse was still, the noise of the press, the flashing cameras, the chatter of reporters, all of it seemed distant, muffled by the hum of the moment. The victory wasn't just hers, but hers to carry forward. Simone's parents held her close, her father's arms tight around her as they stood, tears in their eyes. Her mother was laughing, crying, her face filled with a combination of relief and joy. It wasn't just the verdict, it was the end of months of fear, intimidation, and constant pressure. They had won against an empire. Judge Williams, now presiding over the case after the removal of Judge Kessler, cleared her throat. "The verdict has been read, and the court will proceed with sentencing in due course. Mr. Boft, you will be taken into custody until then. The Johnson family will be allowed to leave as free individuals, with all charges against them fully dismissed." As the courtroom emptied, the reporters descended on Simone and her family. Questions flew at her from all directions, but she remained calm, answering them as best as she could. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the fight they had waged together, the message it sent to everyone who thought they could abuse power without consequence. Outside, the sunlight bathed Pine Grove in warm hues, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt lighter. The community that had been on the brink of being torn apart by Boft's greed was now standing tall, united. As Simone stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the battle lifted from her shoulders. The once overwhelming pressure now felt like a distant memory. She looked around at the crowd of people gathered on the courthouse steps, faces filled with admiration, some even wiping tears away. Neighbors, friends, and complete strangers, people she had never met, but who had rallied behind her family. The sense of community, of solidarity, washed over her like a wave. Her father, Marcus, stood beside her, his proud smile meeting her eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In the quiet understanding between them, Simone knew her parents were as proud of her as she was of them. Together, they had stood firm against the storm. "Simone, over here!" a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone in her direction. She turned to face them, taking a deep breath as she prepared to speak. This moment was bigger than just winning a case. It was about something much more important: justice, resilience, and hope for the future. She stepped forward, her voice clear as she spoke to the crowd. "This victory doesn't just belong to my family. It belongs to every person who has ever stood up against injustice. To every community that has fought back against greed and corruption. This is a victory for all of us." As the crowd erupted in cheers, Simone's eyes caught the sight of Mrs. Walker, standing nearby, her hands clasped tightly together. The elderly woman smiled through her tears, her face full of pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Simone whispered, walking toward her. Mrs. Walker enveloped her in a tight hug, the embrace full of gratitude. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But for the first time in a long while, Simone felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders.